It started with the rain. Not a gentle summer drizzle, but a wall of water that came down in sheets, pounding the fields of Langdon Ridge like it wanted to break the earth open. August storms weren't unusual in this part of rural Missouri, but this one was different. The thunder didn't just roll, it cracked like rifle shots over the Carter family property, echoing off the hills and shaking the windows. Power lines snapped, the house groaned. And in the middle of it, sometime just before 7:30 p.m., 13-year-old Lily Carter was seen walking out into the storm, barefoot, holding nothing, not even a jacket, headed toward the barn that stood about 70 yards from the back porch. Her mother, Sharon, caught only a glimpse of her silhouette through the rain-streaked kitchen window. She called out once, maybe twice, but didn't leave the stove. Dinner was on. Lily wasn't the type to wander. The barn was familiar ground, safe. Or so she thought. By 7:50, when lightning cracked directly above the ridge, the house lost power. Everything went silent. The hum of appliances vanished, the lights snapped out, and in that brief moment of electric silence, Sharon called out for Lily again. Still no answer. She waited. The minutes ticked on. Her unease grew with every second. At 8:07 p.m., she finally stepped out with a flashlight, boots hastily pulled on, calling her daughter's name into the wind. She reached the barn door, wide open. Inside, nothing but shadows and the sour smell of hay soaked with rain. No sign of Lily, no footprints in the mud, no movement, just the storm raging behind her and the unsettling quiet within. By 8:19 p.m., Sharon was dialing 911. The dispatcher noted her voice was tight and urgent, but not yet panicked. "My daughter walked out toward the barn. She hasn't come back." "I can't find her," she said. Within 20 minutes, the first sheriff's deputy arrived, but the storm was working against them. Rising water made several back roads impassable. The driveway itself had become a shallow river. The barn and surrounding pasture were slick with mud, the kind that swallows boot soles. Volunteers gathered despite the conditions, bringing dogs, flashlights, and radios. They formed lines, called her name, and checked tree lines and drainage ditches. But the conditions were nearly impossible. The rain erased everything, footprints, scents, even hope. By midnight, they had nothing. No shoes discarded in the mud, no pieces of clothing caught on a fence post, no cries for help. It was as though the storm hadn't just swallowed Lily. It had erased her. The next morning, daylight brought only more questions. The barn showed no signs of a struggle. The doors were unbroken, the loft untouched, and the tools still hung neatly on the pegboard. Her mother insisted she saw Lily walk that way, but there was no confirmation beyond her word. And with no surveillance cameras on the property and no neighbors close, enough to have seen anything, that moment at the window became the last confirmed sighting of Lily Carter. By the end of the second day, local media picked up the story. "Teen girl vanishes during storm," the headlines read. News crews descended, and theories bloomed like weeds. Some speculated she had run away, others whispered about abduction. But the sheriff's department was cautious. With no signs of forced entry and no known threats, they officially labeled it a missing child probable endangerment. That designation would later shift to suspected abduction, though no suspect was ever named. The FBI offered assistance, but found no digital footprint suggesting she planned to leave. Her phone was in her bedroom, her school bag untouched, no social media activity, no strange online contacts, nothing. Just a girl who walked into a thunderstorm and never came back. Days turned to weeks. Search grids expanded outward. Drones flew over the nearby woods. Helicopters scanned riverbanks. Divers checked retention ponds. Nothing. The terrain had turned against them, dense forest to the east, open farmland to the west, and miles of fencing that hadn't been disturbed. Dogs brought in from Kansas City lost the trail within minutes near the barn. One of them sat down in the mud and refused to move forward, as if confused by the sudden dead zone. It was as if the trail didn't just go cold, it vanished completely. By mid-September, the search officially scaled back. The volunteers stopped arriving daily. The media moved on. Only the Carter family and a few local deputies kept asking questions. Sharon clung to the belief that Lily hadn't been taken by someone she knew, or by anyone at all. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She wasn't scared, she said during the only interview she ever gave. She just walked out and was gone. That sentence would haunt every article written afterward. The phrase, just gone, became a shorthand in Langdon Ridge for something no one could explain but everyone feared. Still, no ransom note ever came. No one claimed responsibility. No neighbors reported suspicious vehicles. And though investigators combed through family history, financial records, and even distant relatives, there was no motive, no enemy, and no trace of any foul play. Just storm clouds, a barn, a barefoot girl, and silence. The kind of silence that grows heavier each day. 6 years later, when the first image surfaced, grainy, dark, and strange, it wasn't Lily's face that startled everyone. It was the shape, the shadow, and the unmistakable way it moved, like someone who hadn't walked among people in a very long time. By the time the storm finally gave way to pale morning light, the Carter property looked like a war zone. Trees lay cracked along the fence lines, the garden was drowned, and the front yard had become a shallow lake. The barn, the last place anyone had seen Lily heading toward, stood intact on the outside, leaning slightly, but upright. Despite the sheriff's initial report about a possible lightning strike, the structure hadn't burnt. The siding was wet, the roof pelted with debris, but it bore no scorch marks, no indication that fire had touched it. Still, it remained the center of the investigation's attention. Sharon hovered just outside the tape, refusing to sit or eat, arms crossed tightly as if physically bracing for the worst. She watched every step law enforcement took toward that barn like her life depended on what they might find inside. The deputies' boots left deep impressions in the soft earth, but what stopped them cold were the smaller ones, smeared tracks, barefoot, leading from the path between the house and the barn door. 4 partial prints, then 3 more, then none. They just ended. No sign of Lily stepping back, no sign of a vehicle, just a child's path vanishing into mud. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of damp hay and oil. The loft was dry, the bales untouched. The floor near the center had puddled slightly from water blown in during the worst of the wind, but nothing appeared overturned or recently disturbed, except for one item. A simple green rubber bracelet, the kind kids wore in packs of 10, sat near the middle of the floor. Her mother confirmed it was Lily's. She'd gotten it at a school fundraiser the week before. Bright neon lettering spelt out, "Be kind." But it wasn't just that the bracelet was there. It was the condition it was in. It was clean. Too clean. Dry to the touch despite the open door and storm surge. It hadn't been dragged in. It hadn't been wet and dried out. It looked like it had been placed there, almost like someone had meant for it to be found. The canine units arrived by mid-morning. Trained trackers with years of experience began their sweeps, looping wide from the barn toward the edge of the woods and circling back. The dogs picked up Lily's scent near the porch, faint but present, then again along the muddy trail toward the barn. But every time they neared the structure, something strange happened. They would stop, sit down, whimper. Not from fear, but confusion. They lost the trail. It simply ceased to exist within 30 feet of the door. One handler quietly told his partner that in 10 years he'd never seen a scent trail just vanish, as if the subject had been lifted from the ground. By the afternoon, drone teams had been called in. Aerial surveys captured the property in high resolution, and infrared scans sought heat signatures beyond the ridgeline. But nothing emerged from the data. There were no recent tire tracks, no sign of a second set of footprints coming or going. It looked to everyone on site like Lily had walked into the barn and simply never walked out. Deputies searched the rafters, feed bins, and the crawl space under the tool shed. Nothing, not even hair. The crime scene unit dusted the docker handle and support beams. No fingerprints, but Sharon's. The forced entry theory was based on scratches around the doorframe, but even those looked aged, like wear and tear. They weren't fresh. Still, the sheriff included it in his report. He didn't like calling it a dead end. Not yet. News trickled out that day that the barn had possibly been the scene of an abduction. Reporters circled, grabbing quotes from neighbors who hadn't spoken to the Carters in years. Some recalled a strange man asking for directions 2 weeks before the storm. Others said they'd seen nothing. One elderly neighbor described seeing a blue truck speed down the main road the night Lily disappeared, but the timeline didn't match, and the license plate was long forgotten. Investigators couldn't rule anything out, but they also couldn't confirm a thing. And when the local paper published a photo of the bracelet on the barn floor, people across the county began to ask a chilling question. If someone took her, why leave that behind? Over the following days, the barn was searched repeatedly. Cadaver dogs were brought in, but none alerted. A forensic team returned with UV lights, hoping for signs of blood or tissue. They found nothing. No clothing, no fibers, no disturbances in the hay. It was as though the barn had watched Lily enter and then locked the secret away. By the end of the week, with no new leads and the trail growing colder by the hour, the barn was sealed off. Not because it was a crime scene, but because there was nothing left to find. The Carter family, still numb from shock, moved into town temporarily, unable to sleep with the empty barn visible from the kitchen window. Sharon kept the bracelet. She never let it leave her pocket. In Langdon Ridge, stories spread fast and silence spreads faster. Some believed Lily had run away, though no one could say why. Others whispered about cults, about old mine shafts, about things that lived in the woods. But investigators focused on what they knew, and the fact remained that all signs pointed to the barn. The last prints, the last object, the last sighting, and yet it offered nothing in return. As the second week closed, the lead detective quietly admitted to his partner that if this was a kidnapping, it was the cleanest he'd ever seen. And if it wasn't, then what happened to her inside that barn? The question lingered, unanswered, suspended in the silence of a structure that seemed to have swallowed her whole. In the beginning, Sharon Carter was treated with gentleness, a woman shattered by loss, surrounded by casseroles and candles, prayers and phone calls. Friends offered shoulders, reporters approached with soft voices, deputies gave her space. Langdon Ridge was small enough that everyone knew the story, and for a time, everyone believed her, believed that her daughter had disappeared into the storm. But in a place where people measure time by Sunday sermons and county fair, ribbons, silence becomes suspicion, and grief, when it lingers too long and speaks too strangely, becomes a reason to look twice. The number 22 started to echo through the town like thunder after a flash. 22 minutes between the last time Sharon saw Lily walking toward the barn and when she finally picked up the phone to dial 911. It wasn't shouted or scrawled on flyers. It floated through conversations, at the diner, at the church, at the gas pump. 22 minutes, long enough to panic, long enough to search, or long enough to clean. The sheriff's office never accused her of anything. Not officially, but the questions they asked began to change. At first, they were gentle. What had Lily eaten that day? Had she been upset? Was there anyone new in her life? But later, they became sharper. Why hadn't Sharon followed her daughter into the storm immediately? Why hadn't she called for help the moment the barn light didn't flicker on? Why was Lily's bracelet dry when everything else was soaked to the bone? Sharon gave the same answer every time. She thought Lily was safe. She thought she'd be back. She thought there was time. But when the clock kept ticking and no one came through the door, she picked up the phone. That was her truth. But truth, in the absence of proof, becomes just another version of a story no one wants to hear. Neighbors who once stood beside her at vigils began to keep their distance. Her best friend stopped returning calls. At the grocery store, people pretended not to see her. At the pharmacy, she caught a clerk watching her a little too closely. Once, she overheard two women whispering by the apples that she must have lost it. And maybe no one wanted to say it out loud. Even the media, once sympathetic, started printing headlines that leaned on insinuation. A mother's silence, one read. What did Sharon know? Said another. Her face, caught mid-blink by a camera flash at the third week's press conference, became the image they all used. It looked like guilt. It looked like grief. No one could tell the difference anymore. Inside the Carter home, Time stopped. Sharon sealed off Lily's bedroom. The door stayed shut, the sheets untouched. The alarm clock was blinking 7:12 from the moment the power went out that night. She stopped eating meals at the table. The garden grew wild. Piles of unopened mail gathered on the counter. Her sister flew in from Oregon to help, but after 6 days of walking on eggshells and watching Sharon sit motionless in front of the cold fireplace, she booked an early flight home. No one knew what to say to her anymore, because Sharon wasn't doing what people wanted grieving mothers to do. She didn't cry on command. She didn't beg for attention. She didn't plead with the camera. She said one thing over and over again. Lily wasn't taken. She vanished. That was her word. Vanished. Not abducted, not murdered. Vanished. That word made people uneasy. It didn't come with a suspect or a motive. It didn't fit into news cycles or podcast interviews. It felt like denial. It felt like deflection. But Sharon clung to it with the desperation of someone who believed there was still something no one else understood. At night, she said she heard things. Whispers, footsteps. Once, tapping against the barn wall, she'd go outside in her robe, flashlight in hand, every time. There was never anything there, but it kept her from sleeping, and it kept her from letting go. She started locking every door. She kept the porch light on all night. Some mornings, she said she found faint impressions in the mud near the fence, like someone had stood there in silence, watching. The sheriff's department moved on to colder leads, other towns, other faces. When pressed, they'd say the case was open and active, but off record, no one had touched the file in months, too clean. No signs of struggle, no prints, no witnesses, no suspect. Just one girl, one barn, one mother, and nothing else. The bracelet, the barn floor, the missing time, none of it added up. But they couldn't charge Sharon with a feeling, and they couldn't solve a disappearance with no crime scene. So the file sat in a drawer, and Sharon sat in her house, alone. By the 1-year mark, public interest had faded. A few online sleuths still tried to connect dots. One YouTube video suggested a satanic cult operating out of the nearby woods. Another blamed Sharon outright, pointing to her odd body language in the press clips. But nothing stuck. No evidence surfaced, and for 6 years, Langdon Ridge simply adjusted to the hole Lily left behind. Her face was still taped to the gas station window, faded by the sun. Her name still showed up on missing persons databases, but for most people, she became part of the background. A ghost of a question that no one wanted to answer, except for Sharon. Every night, she stared at the barn window, waiting for something to move. Every morning, she walked to the edge of the porch, hoping to see bare footprints in the mud. And every time a noise came from the woods, she froze. Because deep down, she believed Lily was still out there, waiting to be found, not taken, not lost, just somewhere no one had thought to look. And then, one spring morning, her phone rang. A deputy's voice, calm but different. "We need you to come in," he said. "We've got something you need to see." She didn't ask what. She didn't have to. Because in her chest, something old and aching cracked open. Hope, terror, everything all at once. And before he could finish the sentence, she was already reaching for her keys. In the months that followed Lily Carter's disappearance, Langdon Ridge transformed into something quieter, more hollow. The porch light stayed on later. Parents walked their children to the school doors instead of letting them run ahead. Rumors had worn thin, but the fear had settled into something deeper, resignation. The storm that took Lily didn't just wipe out tracks or power lines. It wiped out confidence. And yet, the investigation didn't stop. At least not officially. Tips continued to arrive, some anonymous, others frantic. One came from a teenager who swore she saw a blue pickup truck idling at the edge of the woods the night of the storm. Another came from a hunter who claimed to have seen a pale-haired girl walking along County Road 14 at dawn. A discarded backpack was found near a quarry 12 miles away. Its contents were waterlogged beyond recognition. None of it connected. Every clue led somewhere and nowhere. Every lead had promise until it didn't. The truck was traced to a farmer who had been helping neighbors during the blackout. The quarry bag belonged to a camper from out of state, and the girl on the road turned out to be a runaway from Jefferson City who'd been located days later, safe, and very much not Lily Carter. Then there was the parolee. His name surfaced early on, a man recently released from county lockup with a record for petty theft and a questionable past involving minors. He had been staying with his cousin just a few miles from the Carter property. That was enough to earn him a spotlight. Investigators brought him in, interrogated him for hours, and searched his phone, his room, and his vehicle. But nothing linked him to Lily. He barely knew her name, had no idea who the Carters were, and had a rock-solid alibi for the night of the storm, a court-ordered check-in at a halfway house 30 miles away. It was logged, time-stamped, and confirmed by surveillance footage. Still, whispers about him lingered for months, even after law enforcement cleared him completely. It didn't matter. In cases like these, people want monsters, and when there are no monsters, they start making them out of whoever's left. In that fog of dead ends, one witness was almost entirely overlooked. Her name was Harriet Maynard, a retired elementary school teacher who lived 4 blocks from Lily's middle school. She called the sheriff's office twice in early September, both times leaving short, polite messages. She said she'd seen a man, tall, gaunt, wearing a yellow raincoat, standing near the school's rear parking lot around dismissal time. Not once, but 3 times in the weeks before Lily vanished. He never approached anyone, never spoke, just stood there, watching. Her tone on the message wasn't panicked, just curious, concerned maybe. But no one ever called her back. The office was overwhelmed. The lead detective at the time scribbled it in a notebook, passed it to an assistant, and forgot it. Raincoats weren't uncommon in Missouri that time of year. And besides, the sighting was days, maybe weeks, before Lily went missing. It didn't seem relevant, and like so many little details in cases that go nowhere, it slipped between the cracks. But not for Harriet. She brought it up at the grocery store, in passing, to a woman from church. She mentioned it during a quilting circle. Each time she was gently nodded at, maybe pitied, maybe dismissed. Eventually, she stopped mentioning it. When the 1-year vigil came and went, and Lily's picture was taken down from the church bulletin board, Harriet folded the memory into the back of her mind, like an old report card. Filed, forgotten. By the 3rd year, the case was ice cold. Detectives had rotated out, the task force dissolved, files were boxed up, evidence shelved. A few missing person websites still featured Lily's photo, a school portrait, braces barely visible, but even those grew dust online. Her name no longer brought in tips. Her face didn't flash in headlines. The people of Langdon Ridge no longer asked what happened. They quietly began to accept that they'd never know. But Sharon Carter didn't. She still called the sheriff's office once a month, still left messages, still walked to the edge of the barn every morning, still believed that someone knew something and simply hadn't connected the right pieces. It would take nearly 6 years before one of those missing pieces emerged again. Not in a dramatic confession or a box of evidence buried in someone's backyard, but in a chance discovery during the digitization of old records. A young archivist assigned to transfer handwritten case notes into the department's new database stumbled on the name Harriet Maynard. The note beside it read, "Yellow raincoat sighting X3, no contact made." Curious, she flagged it. She shouldn't have. It wasn't procedure. But something about the repetition struck her. She mentioned it to a deputy who'd only been with the department a year, someone too new to dismiss it outright. And for the first time, someone called Harriet back. She was older now, slower. Her memory was hazier than it once had been. But she remembered that raincoat, bright yellow like a school bus. She remembered the way the man stood, too still, not looking at the cars but at the children. She even remembered the way he walked when he finally left, long strides, limp on the left side. She hadn't forgotten. She'd just stopped expecting anyone to care. That detail, dismissed and nearly erased, would take on new weight when paired with what was found weeks later in the root cellar of a collapsed hunting cabin 23 miles east of Langdon Ridge. Because buried beneath damp blankets and old canned goods, investigators uncovered something that shouldn't have survived. A child's sketchbook. and inside it, among page after page of scribbles, was a drawing of a tall man in a yellow coat, watching from a distance, waiting. It was just after dusk when the call came into the Dent County Sheriff's Office. 2 hikers, both in their early 30s, had returned early from a weekend camping trip east of Langdon Ridge. They were visibly shaken, according to the ranger who met them, pale and agitated in a way that didn't fit the typical lost-in-the-woods anxiety. Their story was specific, consistent, and disturbingly clear. At approximately 2 a.m., while camped along a narrow game trail just off the main ridge, they awoke to the sound of a scream, high-pitched, distant, and unmistakably human. It had come in short bursts, not constant, but urgent enough that both men sat upright in their tent, listening in silence as the sound repeated. They estimated it came from about a quarter-mile north, somewhere deep inside the tree line. But what made them leave wasn't just the scream. It was the voice that followed it, lower, guttural, almost inaudible, yelling something they couldn't understand, followed by silence so abrupt it made them pack their gear in the dark and head back before dawn. By morning, deputies had already cordoned off the section of woods where the hikers had camped. The area, known locally as Whistler's Hollow, wasn't unfamiliar to law enforcement. Over the years, it had been the site of illegal hunting, off-grid encampments, and more than a few teenage dares. But this time felt different. The coordinates led them to a patch of dense underbrush about 20 miles east of where Lily Carter had disappeared nearly 3 years earlier. The ground was soft, covered in a blanket of rotting leaves. Within the first hour, deputies found signs of recent human activity. There were boot prints, faded but distinct, and a pile of fast food wrappers half buried beneath a log. The brand had closed 2 years prior. A few feet beyond, they noticed something hanging between 2 trees. 3 sections of rope, frayed and knotted crudely, tied at different heights like makeshift restraints. The bark on the trunks was scarred in long vertical streaks, as if something or someone had repeatedly been dragged against them. Photographs were taken, samples were bagged. But when forensic specialists arrived, the limitations became clear. There was no blood, no hair, no fingerprints. The wrappers were too degraded for prints, and the rope, likely exposed to rain and insects, yielded nothing. Still, investigators pressed deeper into the woods. Dogs were brought in and trained in both scent tracking and cadaver detection, but they failed to hit on anything conclusive. One dog paused briefly near a dry creek bed, pacing in tight circles before sitting down, tail still. The handler noted the reaction, but couldn't confirm a scent. Deputies marked the area anyway, and searchers returned to it over the next 2 days, hoping for something, anything, that could tie the forest to Lily Carter. Meanwhile, word spread fast. Local Facebook groups lit up with speculation. Screams in Whistler's Hollow became the newest theory in a case that had already bred too many. Amateur sleuths posted maps, compared satellite images, and cross-referenced animal attack reports. But underneath the online noise, one name surfaced again, and again: Emery Gault. A former forestry worker turned recluse, Gault had lived in a hunting cabin on the western edge of the forest for over a decade before dying in April 2020. His death, ruled natural causes, came weeks after his neighbor reported not seeing him for months. He was found alone, slumped in a camp chair, his last can of food still unopened beside him. At the time, no one had linked him to the Carter case. He had no criminal record, no known connection to the family, and had been dismissed by detectives early on due to lack of proximity to the disappearance site. But now, with the screams, the rope, and the unexplained presence of human activity, the proximity no longer seemed insignificant. Deputies revisited the property, which by then had nearly collapsed under years of neglect. Inside the cabin, mold coated the walls, and rodents had chewed through most of the remaining furniture. But tucked behind a warped wooden dresser, hidden inside a rusted ammo box, they found something no one expected: drawings. Dozens of them, some on notebook paper, others on old grocery receipts or the backs of advertisements. They were crude, done in pencil and sometimes crayon, and each one featured the same figure: a young girl, barefoot with long hair falling past her shoulders, always alone. In some, she stood beside a tree. In others, she was shown crouched inside a small box-like room. One sketch showed her screaming, her mouth open wide, while another showed a tall figure standing behind her, coat trailing to his knees. The drawings were turned over to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, but the lack of identifying information made it impossible to confirm their origin. No fingerprints, no DNA, no signatures, just images. Investigators noted that the girl in the drawings bore a resemblance to Lily Carter, but it wasn't definitive. They couldn't prove the drawings were of her, only that they showed a recurring theme: a child watched, confined, observed. The possibility that someone had been living in or near that forest, keeping a child hidden, became impossible to ignore. But without a body, without a witness, it remained a possibility suspended in air. The sheriff's department held a press conference a week later. They confirmed that they had reopened specific leads in connection to the Carter investigation, but emphasized that no physical evidence had been recovered. The public was asked to stay away from the area while the investigation continued. Unofficially, though, interest began to fade. Without a new breakthrough, the story slowly slid from the headlines. Deputies returned to regular patrols. The hikers who reported the scream stopped returning media calls. The forest, thick with secrets and shadows, returned to silence. But Sharon Carter never did. She went out there once herself, escorted by a deputy, walking the same trail the hikers had taken. She stood where the ropes had been, touched the bark where the knots had left grooves, and whispered her daughter's name into the trees. She said later the air felt heavy, like it was holding something back. She didn't cry. She didn't speak much, but before she left, she picked up a broken twig near the base of one of the trees and placed it into her pocket. She said it felt important. She didn't know why, just that it wasn't meant to be left behind. In June of 2025, 6 years after Lily Carter disappeared, the case was all but buried beneath the weight of time and silence. Her photo still sat in aging databases, her name still turned up on missing persons registries, but no one expected an answer anymore. Not the detectives who had rotated through the file, not the Carter family who had learned to live around the ache, and not the town of Langdon Ridge, where her story had faded into whispered memory. That changed, without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when a freelance real estate photographer, commissioned to survey a forgotten patch of land near the old forestry cabins east of town, launched his drone for a standard aerial pass. The property had once belonged to the late Emery Galt. Overgrown, uninhabitable, and set to be auctioned by the state, the land was being cataloged purely for records. What the drone captured wasn't expected, and it wasn't immediate. The photographer almost missed it entirely. Reviewing the footage later that evening, he scrubbed through several minutes of standard forest terrain, tree canopies, scattered debris, collapsed roofing, until a flicker near the 7-minute mark made him pause. At first glance, it looked like nothing. A blur, a lens anomaly. But when he slowed the frame and boosted the contrast, he saw a movement. Not animal, not wind. Human. A figure emerging from behind a dying pine, visible for just over 2 seconds before disappearing behind another tree. It wasn't clear. The resolution degraded slightly with motion, and the light bent sharply through the tree cover. But what could be made out chilled him to his core. The figure was barefoot, thin, arms held close to the body, long hair draped over the shoulders, tangled and matted, and most hauntingly, a limp. The left leg moved slower than the right, almost dragging. The photographer watched the clip a dozen times before he called the sheriff's office. The footage was logged the same evening. A digital forensic team reviewed and enhanced the sequence, running it through motion correction software and pixel stabilization. What emerged was still blurry, still partial, but unmistakably human. The gait, the frame, the proportion, it wasn't a trick of light. Someone had been there. A woman or adolescent, likely underweight, likely barefoot, wearing something that blended into the forest floor. There were no clear facial features, no voice, no time-stamped interaction. But it was enough. Enough to send deputies back into the woods where the screams had once been heard, where the ropes had once hung, and where Galt's cabin still sat in collapse. This time, they brought more than flashlights, Search teams assembled with fresh urgency. Drones were flown in from state headquarters, bloodhounds, thermal cameras, cadaver dogs. The perimeter was expanded 5 miles in every direction, and command tents were erected at the nearest fire road. But the forest had changed. Growth had swallowed trails, old markers were gone, and whatever presence had been there, if it had ever truly left, was keeping itself hidden. Still, they searched. Deputies moved in slow grid patterns, volunteers combed riverbanks, night operations were authorized, and every now and then, a new piece of information was passed through the chain. An old boot print near a ridge, a snapped branch at an unnatural height, or a discarded can with a recent expiration. Each clue led deeper, but not closer. Until one of the drones caught something else. This time, it wasn't movement. It was stillness. In a ravine roughly 3/4 of a mile east of the original sighting, a heat signature was picked up during an early morning pass, faint but stable, tucked under a ledge beneath a fallen tree. Teams were dispatched immediately, but when they arrived, the space was empty. No person, no items. But the dirt beneath the rock was warm, recently used, ashes from a fire buried in haste, a handful of small bones, animal most likely, but also a makeshift cloth bundle, damp and rotting. Inside was a child's sock, age unknown, size consistent with a girl between 10 and 13. That night, the sheriff's office made a rare public statement. They didn't confirm identity, they didn't promise answers, but they acknowledged the footage, and they confirmed that the area was under active investigation related to a long-term missing persons case. The words were chosen carefully. But across Langdon Ridge, there was only one name people whispered: Lily. The story exploded. Local news picked it up first, then regional stations, then national outlets. 6 years of silence broken by seconds of video, a flicker of motion in a forgotten forest. Sharon Carter was notified the same morning. She was shown the footage privately. According to the investigator who sat with her, she didn't cry. She watched in complete silence, then whispered just one word: left. In the days that followed, more surveillance was deployed. Trail cameras, motion sensors, but whoever or whatever had appeared in that drone footage was gone again. The tracks led nowhere. But the possibility had reopened everything. Detectives who hadn't looked at the Carter case in years returned to it with fresh eyes. Old timelines were reconstructed, witnesses re-interviewed. The man in the yellow raincoat was revisited. The drawings found in Galt's cabin were compared to the blurry outline from the drone stills. Experts couldn't confirm a match. But one child psychiatrist noted something strange. The posture in the sketch, the stance of the girl, and the way her arms were drawn close to her chest. It mirrored the frame caught by the drone. Tension, isolation, a learnt stillness. No one said it aloud, not yet. But the thought was growing. Had Lily Carter survived? Was she still out there? Injured, alone, hiding, maybe not even knowing that people were still looking for her? It had been 6 years. But now, the forest had answered, just once, and even if it said nothing more, it had already said enough. By the time the 7th day of the renewed search came, morale was thinning. The drone footage had reawakened the case, but the leads it produced scattered in every direction, none of them converging on anything solid. Wildlife cameras captured shadows, and heat sensors picked up transient signatures. Animals, probably. Temporary shelters were found, but none felt lived in. Deputies combed through dense thickets, overgrown fire roads, and abandoned shacks with the growing weight of déjà vu. It felt like chasing a ghost. And then, just beyond the tree line of the ridge near Emery Galt's former property, where no formal structure had ever been mapped, a search team stumbled across what looked like the moss-covered footprint of a collapsed outbuilding. Hidden beneath brambles, half swallowed by tree roots, was a square of cracked concrete. Someone noticed the faint outline of a trap door. Hinges rusted, the handle gone. They cleared it slowly, expecting nothing more than a buried tool shed or a collapsed septic space. But when the crowbar cracked through the soil-caked edge and the door groaned open, what lay beneath brought everything to a standstill. The air that rose out of the cellar was stale, dead with rot and mildew. Flashlights cut into the dark, revealing a narrow descent into a shallow earthen room roughly 6 feet by 10. The space was barely tall enough to stand in, the walls reinforced with scavenged planks, the floor a mat of damp soil and debris. The first thing they noticed was the smell, mold, decay, the unmistakable tang of human habitation long abandoned. On the far end was a pile of rotting blankets layered with dirt. Empty canned goods lined one corner, labels half-eaten by insects. Most dated back at least 3 years. There were no fresh footprints, no visible blood, and no signs of recent struggle. But on the far wall, tucked behind what looked like an old curtain rod jammed into the dirt, was a cloth bag, water-stained but intact. Inside was a child's sketchbook. Each page was warped from moisture. The drawings were rough but intentional, stick figures, animals, crude depictions of trees and houses. One sketch showed a small figure under a heavy cloud, lines radiating from it, lightning maybe. Another showed a structure, square, with no windows. But the most telling detail was the repetition of a name, scribbled in different corners on different pages, as if it had been practiced again and again. Lily. Sometimes in block letters, sometimes rushed, childlike, sometimes nearly illegible, but always the same name. Beneath one drawing, written faintly in pencil, were the words, "I was here." Samples from the sketchbook were sent for rapid DNA testing. Authorities didn't tell the public what they were analyzing, not at first. But behind closed doors, every agency involved knew what they were hoping for. Within 72 hours, the results came back. Skin cells and trace material embedded in the pages matched Lily Carter's profile with over 99.9% certainty. Not a partial match. Not a sibling. Her. The news spread before the press conference could be written. That cellar hadn't just held old blankets in cans. It held the first confirmed proof that Lily Carter had survived long past the storm. She had been alive, possibly for years, possibly until recently. The image of her name, scrawled with such lonely urgency, echoed across the country. People remembered her face again, reposted her picture, wondered aloud what she had seen, what she had endured, and, most of all, where she could be now. Theories exploded. Was she being moved? Was someone still keeping her hidden? Had she escaped, only to go deeper into the forest? No one could say. The cellar showed no signs of current use. No fresh tracks led in or out. Search teams expanded the perimeter another 10 miles. The FBI brought in scent-tracking vapor sensors and silent reconnaissance drones. Every nearby hunting cabin, known and undocumented, was investigated. But the terrain was unforgiving, and time was no longer on their side. The presence of her DNA, the drawings, the clear message she had left behind, it changed everything and nothing. They had proof of her survival, but no path forward. Sharon Carter was told in person. A team of 3 officials met her at home, each of them uncertain how to explain that her daughter had once occupied that space, had left behind those words, and had likely drawn those images herself. She didn't cry when they told her. Not at first. She asked if anyone else had been down there. They told her no. She asked if there had been signs of someone else living in the space. They told her nothing conclusive. She sat quietly for several minutes before saying, then she made it out. That belief, said so simply, became her entire focus. She didn't ask what it meant that Lily had been down there alone. She didn't ask what kind of person might have brought her there in the first place. All she wanted to know was where her daughter had gone next. The cellar was sealed. Its contents were bagged and archived. The structure itself was flagged for forensic excavation, but weather delays pushed the timeline further into the summer. For now, it remained as they found it, a silent earthen space beneath the forest floor, holding just enough to prove she'd been there, but not enough to show where she'd gone. One deputy later said the most haunting thing wasn't the sketches or the canned goods. It was the makeshift bedding in the corner. It had been formed from layered blankets, cardboard, and bundled shirts that looked folded deliberately. Like someone had been trying to create a space they could survive in. Someone young, someone alone. The nation watched as the case re-entered the spotlight. But the question had changed. Not what happened to Lily Carter. Not anymore. The question now was simple. How far had she got before the world realized she was still trying to come home? After the discovery of the root cellar and the confirmation that Lily Carter had once been there, the investigative floodgates reopened. Every theory, every dead lead, every dismissed tip from 6 years prior was hauled back into the light. Detectives who had long since rotated off the case were pulled back in. Analysts re-examined logs. Witnesses were contacted again, starting with the small handful who'd mentioned unusual sightings in the weeks leading up to the storm. One in particular, once considered too vague to act on, now stood out with alarming clarity. It came from Harriet Maynard, a retired teacher who had reported seeing a man in a yellow raincoat lingering near the school drop-off zone on 3 separate occasions before Lily vanished. At the time, it had been noted, logged, and ultimately dismissed. Yellow raincoats weren't rare, and the man hadn't approached anyone. But now, that detail felt less like a coincidence and more like a warning everyone had ignored. Investigators dug into school maintenance records, custodial staffing lists, and third-party contractor logs. Eventually, a name resurfaced. Carl Dunn. He had worked part-time as a groundskeeper at Langdon Middle School till he was quietly terminated just 5 months before Lily disappeared. His file was thin. No criminal history, no formal complaints, but his dismissal had been abrupt, attributed to unprofessional behavior and missed shifts. No further action had been taken. His contact information was outdated. No forwarding address. When they cross-referenced his last known location, it aligned with a rural rental property about 12 miles from Whistler's Hollow. A landlord had cleared the space in early 2021 after Dunn stopped paying rent. What the landlord found inside was unsettling, but at the time, it had seemed more tragic than suspicious. Carl Dunn's body had been discovered in the nearby woods, wrapped in a tarp and buried under shallow brush. The cause of death was ruled suicide by overdose. An empty pill bottle beside him, no signs of trauma, no farewell note. The sheriff's department, then overwhelmed with unrelated rural cases, had closed the file without public announcement. But the belongings found in his rented cabin were cataloged quietly. Most were discarded: clothing, food wrappers, old electronics. But a few personal effects had been boxed and stored. One item had caught the landlord's attention, but not his suspicion. It was a child's hairbrush, pale blue plastic with a faded cartoon sticker still stuck to the back. Scrawled in black permanent marker across the handle was one word: Lily. When detectives were alerted to the hairbrush, it was sent immediately for testing. Within 48 hours, forensic analysts confirmed a match. Trace hairs embedded in the bristles belonged to Lily Carter. No question, no margin of error. That single object, tucked away in a box that had sat untouched for over 4 years, was the link no one had found. Dunn had possessed something that belonged to Lily, something personal. And suddenly, the quiet man in the yellow coat was no longer a vague figure in the background. He was central. The question was no longer whether he'd seen her. It was what he'd done to her, or with her, and for how long. Neighbors of Dunn described him as forgettable, kept to himself, walked with a slight limp, shopped late at night, rarely spoke. The yellow raincoat had stood out only because it was bright, a contrast to the rest of him. One woman remembered him carrying a duffel bag to and from his truck. It never looked heavy, but he treated it like it was fragile. No one had reported him as suspicious. No one had thought to ask where he went after being fired. But the proximity to the school, the timing of his termination, and the items found in the cellar, all of it began to line up in a timeline too specific to dismiss. Investigators now believed it was possible that Dunn had abducted Lily the night of the storm, potentially luring her from the barn or intercepting her along the path. The bracelet found near the door, dry, deliberately placed, could have been dropped after the fact, a tactic to confuse the scene. Dunn had mechanical knowledge and construction experience. Building a hidden root cellar wouldn't have been beyond his skill. The woods, the rope, the concealed shelter, all of it pointed to a scenario in which Lily had been kept alive, at least for a time, in captivity. But what no one could yet explain was why. Why her? Why then? And what had happened in the time between Dunn's death and the sighting captured by the drone years later? If Dunn had died in 2021, yet Lily's DNA had been found in a cellar possibly used after that, then one terrifying possibility emerged. She had survived him, perhaps escaped, perhaps left behind, alone. That notion reframed everything. It suggested not only had she endured years in isolation, but she may have lived in the forest, fending for herself for months, maybe even years, after the man who took her was gone. That level of resilience was rare, unbelievable, almost. And yet, it now seemed entirely possible. Sharon Carter was told about Dunn in private. The details were delivered carefully. She asked just one question, whether he was still alive. When they told her no, she nodded once and didn't speak again for several minutes. She later told a family friend that she didn't feel relief, not really. The man who had taken her daughter was gone, but Lily wasn't home. That was the only thing that mattered. Investigators pressed on, now focused on tracking Lily's movements post-Dunn, the sightings, the fire ashes, the improvised shelters, and always the question repeating like a heartbeat. If she had been there all this time, why hadn't she come forward? Or worse, what was she still running from? The moment investigators gained access to Carl Dunn's abandoned cabin, the air grew heavy with a tension that seemed almost physical. The dilapidated structure was more than just a forgotten shelter. It was a repository of secrets that had remained hidden for years, buried beneath the grime and the silence of the forest. Among the scattered papers, rusted tools, and worn-out furniture, forensic teams discovered an old, battered hard drive tucked inside a rusted metal box beneath the floorboards. It was labeled simply, "Security." The team didn't hesitate. This, they hoped, would finally answer the questions that had haunted them since the discovery of the yellow raincoat and the child's hairbrush. Forensic technicians worked around the clock to recover the data. The footage they retrieved was grainy and flickering, captured by a network of surveillance cameras Dunn had installed throughout his property. But what the cameras revealed was nothing short of chilling. The first sequences showed a small, pale figure, a girl, inside the cabin's cramped interior. She was barely recognizable. Her hair was tangled, her clothes dirty and torn, and her frame frail and diminished. The girl moved cautiously, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She ate what looked like canned food, sometimes fed by a shadowy figure whose face was never fully seen, but whose presence was unmistakable. The tapes documented weeks, then months of this hidden captivity. The girl was isolated, confined mostly to the cabin, and rarely allowed outside. Dunn's voice, sometimes audible on the recordings, was low and obsessive. He spoke of protecting her from the world, repeating that phrase with a disturbingly possessive tenderness. It was clear this was no random abduction. Dunn had constructed a world for this girl, a prison wrapped in delusion. The footage even captured moments of his anger when she attempted to escape, his frustration palpable as she tried to slip past his watchful eye. One tape, recorded in early 2022, showed a brief moment of rebellion. The girl had somehow managed to get outside the cabin, barefoot, limping, and disoriented, but the freedom was short-lived. The video ended with her being pulled back inside, struggling, crying softly, and Dunn's quiet, cruel reassurance that she belonged nowhere else. The injury she sustained during the escape attempt was visible, a deep scrape along her ankle, raw and infected. Then came the sudden end of the footage, just months before Dunn's death in 2021. No further recordings. No indication of what happened after. Yet, the cabin was found intact but abandoned, as if Dunn had left in a hurry or passed away suddenly, leaving the girl behind. Among the papers discovered in the cabin was a diary, its pages yellowed and fragile. Dunn's handwriting was scrawled and erratic, filled with contradictions, expressions of love twisted with control, confessions of obsession, and a haunting passage that read, "I protect her from the world. No one understands. She is mine, fragile and broken. They would take her away if they knew. I keep her safe from pain, from lies. She must stay hidden. The world is cruel, but here, she is safe." The diary revealed a disturbing mindset, a man convinced he was both captor and guardian, prisoner and protector. The words painted a picture of isolation, fear, and a twisted devotion that had imprisoned a child for years. The diary did not mention what happened after his death. No note of release, no farewell. What followed Dunn's death was even more unsettling. The girl, Lily, vanished again. The drone footage from 2025 suggested she had survived her captor, but now alone, wounded, and terrified, she was left to navigate the unforgiving wilderness by herself. Search teams found no trace of her after Dunn's demise. The forest swallowed her once more, this time without a shred of shelter or safety. This realization shattered the fragile hope that the girl had been rescued or found soon after Dunn's passing. Instead, it exposed a new nightmare. Lily had survived years of captivity only to be cast into the wild, vulnerable, and unprotected. The truth in the footage was devastating. Survival had not meant freedom, but a prolonged ordeal of isolation and fear. The implications rippled through the investigation, reframing every previous lead and every unanswered question. The search was no longer just about finding a missing child. It was about understanding the depth of human cruelty and resilience, the tragic intersection of obsession and abandonment. For Sharon Carter, the knowledge was a double-edged sword, relief that her daughter had been alive after all, but heartbreak that she had endured such suffering and was still out there, lost in the shadows. The case, reignited by grainy images and fragile memories, stood at a crossroads. Hope clung stubbornly to the edges of despair, driving a new wave of urgency to bring Lily home, not just from the forest, but from the nightmare she had lived for so long. 6 years had passed since Lily Carter disappeared from Langdon Ridge under the roar of that violent thunderstorm, and in all that time, her name lingered like a ghost in the collective memory of the town. There were vigils, rumors, dead ends, and years of unanswered questions that clawed at the hearts of those who loved her. Then, without warning, hope returned on an ordinary summer afternoon in July of 2025, carried by the most unexpected discovery. A local maintenance worker was driving a routine route along a forgotten back road near the edge of the dense forest, where the drone had once caught that fleeting glimpse of a figure. The day was already heavy with heat, the kind that presses down on the skin and weighs the air with stillness. As he passed a shallow storm drain buried beneath a tangle of wild grasses and undergrowth, something caught his eye. Curled up in the narrow channel was a small, fragile figure, barefoot, skin sunburnt and cracked, hair matted and unkempt. At first, he thought it might be a lost animal or a vagrant seeking shelter, but as he drew nearer, the shallow, uneven breaths confirmed something far more startling. There, lying in the dirt, was Lily Carter. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their faces tight with urgency but flickering with hope. Lily was severely malnourished, her body fragile and wasted from years of hardship. Her clothes hung in tatters, soaked through with sweat and grime, stained from the unforgiving forest. She was dehydrated, sunburnt, and covered in cuts and bruises. But she was alive, miraculously, defiantly alive. The hospital staff worked tirelessly, wrapping her in blankets, stabilizing her fragile frame, and beginning the slow process of healing a body that had endured more than most could imagine. In those early days, Lily was almost silent, her eyes wide and watchful, locked in a state of wary alertness that refused comfort. The trauma of years spent in captivity and hiding left her cautious, fearful even of the softest voices. It was not until days later that she spoke, first in broken fragments, whispered memories that began to peel back the layers of her ordeal. She told of the cabin, the cold floors, the man who kept her hidden from the world, and the rope that bound her more tightly than chains. She spoke of an escape, one desperate, painful night when she had fled into the woods, wounded and afraid, only to be caught and dragged back inside. Her ankle had been scraped raw, the scar a permanent reminder of her failed attempt at freedom. Then came the years after his death, she said, the months of living in silence, moving like a shadow through the forest, afraid of rescuers, of strangers, and most of all, of being taken back. She had learnt to disappear, to stay hidden, to survive on whatever the land gave her. The drone had found her before anyone else, its quiet eyes above the trees capturing her presence where none had dared look. That glimpse had been the turning point, the thread of light pulling her back from the darkness. News of Lily's discovery rippled through Langdon Ridge and beyond, breaking through years of silence and reopening wounds that had never fully healed. For the community that had watched a young girl vanish into the storm and never return, the miracle of her survival was both a balm and a fresh ache. It was impossible to reconcile the innocence they had lost with the girl who returned, a survivor carved by trauma and solitude, carrying the weight of years stolen away. For Sharon Carter, the moment she was reunited with her daughter was overwhelmingly beyond words. Holding Lily in her arms for the first time in 6 years, she wept not only for the joy of return, but for all the moments lost: birthdays, school days, laughter silenced by fear. The relief was tangled with pain, a fragile hope born from years of uncertainty. Sharon had never stopped believing, never stopped searching in her heart, but the reality of Lily's survival was more harrowing than she could have imagined. Authorities swiftly shifted gears, turning the case from one of disappearance to a profound investigation into captivity, resilience, and escape. Questions surged anew. Who had kept Lily hidden for so long? Were there others involved? How had she managed to survive alone after her captor's death? And how would she heal from the scars left on her body and soul? The forensic evidence, the drone footage, the hidden cellar, all pieces of a grim puzzle that was finally taking shape. The community grappled with the enormity of the truth. Lily's return was a reminder of human endurance and cruelty intertwined, a story of silence broken and shadows lifted. It forced a reckoning with the failures, the missed signs, and the painful realities of trauma. But it also sparked a fragile hope that even after the darkest of nights, light could find its way back. Lily's journey back to life would be long and fraught with challenges, but it was a beginning. Her story, once lost in the depths of the forest and the silence of fear, had finally come home. And with her return, the mystery that had haunted Langdon Ridge for 6 years began to close, not with the finality of forgetting, but with the opening of wounds that needed healing and hearts that needed mending.